throw people off. But what can you do? Anyway, it's good to see you all. When I say you all, I mean Quint Rankid and Travis Moore. So now I can say two people. It's a plural. It makes sense. How's it been? How you going? I hope you're enjoying, if you're in Japan, this long weekend. We have Culture Day tomorrow. I don't know, whenever I hear Culture Day, I start thinking of Mr. Vane by Culture Beat, showing my age perhaps. But yes, anyway, it's been a cultural weekend, I suppose. I haven't really done anything particularly cultural, come think of it. I've played some Fortnite with the lad. Bit of rugby in the park. Of course, we watched the World Cup final. Well, the third place match on Friday, which New Zealand did win, so yeah, we're number 3. Check out the Manu Samoa jersey right now. Actually went to the welcome event. It's a good jersey. Yes, yesterday, of course, South Africa, England, and it was a good game. It was actually generally speaking, World Cup rugby finals are not good games. Everyone's like so afraid of losing, they just play really defensively, and they're not very interesting. But this was a great final, and for people who complain, who say that rugby is more predictable, say, than soccer, for example, I mean, no one would have predicted Japan coming top of its pool, and each one of the, New Zealand losing its semi-final, for example, and then England were hot favourites for the final based on how they've been playing, and South Africa dominated them. So, it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion how any game is going to go. But of course, third-time champions, deserving winners, South Africa. That was pretty cool. Hey, good to see everybody rolling in. Tai Nakamura, what's up indeed? Good to see you. Odi Jr., good morning, buenos dias. Yes, I'm early. I thrown everybody off by being on time. And nothing better to do, although I also did just tweet out giddy on that, so sorry about that. But we're still warming up. Martin Orlando, good to see you. Friend from Cambridge is in Japan for the Rugby World Cup. Well, it's been fantastic to see so many people come out for the Rugby World Cup. And in fact, that reminds me, I just tweeted something which I'm actually probably going to add to the magazine. Let's do that over here while we let people roll in. I just saw a series of stats. There's a press release from the World Cup people, and I know that every time they do an Olympics or World Cup, they say this was the greatest Olympics or the greatest World Cup ever, and of course you say that every time, and of course it's the goal to be that every time. But genuinely, Japan has done a bang-up job with this World Cup. They really have. They've actually, the sort of records that they've set are the sort of records that even in really big rugby playing countries, it's not easy to expect. Things like a 99.3% attendance, and this is at every game. This is like at Uruguay versus whoever they were playing in their pool matches. I mean, this is like the Namibia game that I went to. 99, these were enormous stadiums, 50, 60, 70,000 people, and they were 99.3% sold for every game in the World Cup. Japanese people, they just they get into their matsuri, which is something that I very much, it's what you expect. Japanese, they're pretty good for a party. I mean, another example, I didn't actually feature in the stories today, but of course we had Halloween during the week, and we had the Halloween parties before and after the weekend, and again, even when they tried to discourage the partying, it was a bit footloose, it was a bit old people regulating the young. And they banned alcohol in every fun part of Shibuya, and yet even without the alcohol, I mean, this is millennials, I don't drink anyway, right? I mean, young people nowadays, which is a good thing, I respect actually. And so the alcohol ban didn't do anything. I mean, there were a couple of arrests, as you'd expect with big crowds of people and idiots, but that was good, and people still get into it. Shibuya was packed with people sort of doing a big cosplay party, which was awesome. So it has been. I'm going to figure out how to make this stick longer. I should, you know what it is? I should go into the settings of this and stop the screen checking out so soon. So I might do that. Well, I'll do that another time anyway. But yes, it's been anyway. It's been a good week. Not a lot of news stories. So of course, as before, actually, I had a lot of fun last time. Towards the end, you guys were just getting warmed up, giving me topics and stuff. Remember, if you add Mark Kiko Simon, it will pop up orange in my chatty thing over here, which I'm looking at, which looks like I'm looking at the comments on the screen, but actually, well, you can think of it that way. I'm looking at the comments over here. So give me topics to talk about. But I've got a handful. I've got the Rugby World Cup. We've got the Shuri Castle fire. What else have we got in here? We've got Well, that's about it. There's not a lot. There's a few sort of interesting topics this week. Maybe one which I'll start with. I don't actually have a link for, but it's from Victor on Facebook. Give me a break, man. He posted a post which I didn't actually say very much about. I'm going to do it in video format so you can all ping Victor and say, hey. It's kind of an indirect 2.5 Voyages. Yes, I will give my thoughts on him seeing somebody on Facebook calling their kid a double instead of a half, and my thoughts on that I will share. Although I'm not sure, as a woke self-hating white person, I'm not sure that I should be speaking too much about identity politics, about things. Well, we'll get into that in a moment. Anyway, what the hell? It's not gonna hold me back. But anyway, who else we got? I see that we have more people coming in. Davo Hunter, Davo Hunter, good to see you. Davo, hello from Davo in the train room. Oh, in the train room right now? Well, good to see you anyway, Davo. We've got Sergeant Bilko, Tokyo 503, James Kelly, Believe in Yourself, good to see you indeed. Good to see everybody there in the comments. So why don't we do this? We'll start off with that. Especially, I'm kind of curious. I mean, there are a few people in the comments I can see right off the bat who are probably half or whatever. But I'm curious how many people are who identify with this. And a question: what do you think about the label half? And do you like the label double instead? And what's my view on this? As someone who has a half kid, who grew up in, well, at times yes, and at times not, multicultural. I had half Japanese friends and Nikkei friends growing up. Some of my best friends are half people. I don't know that qualifies me to say anything, but I'll tell you what I think. Well, the reason I don't even like to get into this debate is, first of all, I mean, half is a really, it's a very baseline way of identifying somebody, and to me it's the same as saying fat, tall, skinny, punk. Like judging by their fashion or their superficial appearance, a big nose, pale skin, whatever. It's like, in the end of the day, it's partly tribal. It's partly, the thing is, like, tribal affiliations, like for example being a New Zealander or being a Australian or whatever. These obviously are not. With Japan, it's a little bit more blurred. But generally speaking, of course, you can be any race and be a nationality, and you can't just look at someone generally and pick their nationality. I mean, not always the case, of course. And Japan's one of the places where people sometimes think they can challenge that. But generally speaking, it's it's a very superficial kind of identity which people impose on you if you're half or whatever. It does align with culture, it does align with nationality, and it does align with ethnicity. But depending on how you look at the word, Mr. Cordychap, thank you for that clarification, and good to see you, Tech Art too. So the point is that if you know somebody not very well, and all that you know, and if you happen to know that either you hear from somebody or you know them well enough to at least know that if you know someone well enough to know that where their parents are from, you probably aren't going to think of them as half. Well, this is the first point I want to make. If you know someone's name, if you know anything about their personality, and yet you still think of them primarily by their race or by their racial grouping, something's kind of wrong with you. So the fact that people spend much of their lives focused on worrying about what people who don't know them think of them by the association that they have with the groups that they're with. Now, I understand there's good reasons for that, particularly if you're not in a privileged group, if you're in a group that's subject to discrimination based on the superficial judgments, and there are many. I can understand why you'd be focused on that external identity sort of thing. But for myself, the reason I don't have much of an opinion about it is, for the people that I know, and for my son is my son, and I appreciate that as a half he has different experiences to me. If you want to look deeply inside yourself and find something exotic, good news, we're all from Botswana. So there's a latest scientific study that came out this week. There's no such thing as pure race, for a start. I mean, the whole idea of racial identity Race for a start is a social construct. I mean, you say black, but I mean, how many different types of black people are there? How many races are there in Africa? I mean, the idea that Kenyans and South African bush people and West Africans are the same race, and Algerians and Egyptians is ridiculous to begin with, right? And so I get, in the end of the day, the idea of being an Asian American, you can be. Well, when you say Asian, are you Korean or Filipino, or are you mixed? Are you both? And if you look at Japanese, anthropological history, Japan itself was a melting pot, it turns out, of Filipinos, Siberians, Mongolians, Koreans, Chinese, that all just sort of got together and had sex with each other on this island. And that's what pretty much every country and every race is. I mean, people in Europe came out of Africa. They went, supposedly sort of Middle East and then sort of Central Asia, and then they migrated west, and then they kept migrating on top of each other. And there's Mongols, there's Neanderthals, there's different species. I mean, we screwed everything. So for a start, I could say myself, for example, and I have, although obviously I don't consider myself a true half, but look, my parents are different nationalities. My mother is Australian, my father actually is Fijian. He's born in British citizen, but born in Fiji. Not ethnically Fijian, but even in Fiji, of course, it's 50% Indian and 50%, indigenous Fijian, and then there were people like my grandfather who was sort of over there owning a hotel for retirement. So, I'm the only born New Zealander in my family. My father became a New Zealand citizen, but my mum and my sister are both Australian. So I grew up saying I was, my friends are half Maori. Well, I'd say, hey, I'm half Australian. Which is bullshit, right? I mean, even the New Zealand side of my family came over from Australia, and everyone from there came over from UK, and from UK there were Scots and there were Welsh. I recently found out there's some Irish, and who gives a shit, right? I mean, you take Yorkshire, they all came from, half the English people came from Yorkshire, who themselves came from Scandinavia. But again, you keep going far enough back, eventually you'll just get to Botswana, and what's the point? Anyway, sorry. It's a lot of halves. I find it interesting, but in the end of the day, you realize that you don't have to go very far back for it all to become completely meaningless. So, okay, objectively from, we are the world, of course, it doesn't matter. Well, look at me, I'm a middle-aged blonde white person, doing fairly well. So, of course, I'm in a position of it being easy to say. And truth is, there is a half cultural identity, half people have a particular sort of experience. I mean, every sort of person has a particular experience, but yes, there are things that I guess half people can share in common, including a complex about the label, the word half, the idea that it's half. So I think the question that Give Me a Break Man asked, I've spent 10 minutes talking about this already, I should get to the point, is that he asked, is the word, there were people who insisted on having their kids be called doubles instead of halves. And what do I think of that? I think that's a load of horse shit. I don't know, what do you think? I mean, look, like someone said, there's a lot of halves. I mean, I'm multiples, baby. I'm not even doubles, right? I mean, I'm people always call me squared, right? I think that's what they meant. It's because I was so many awesome things that they call me a square. Yeah, they should. I'm not gonna call my kid a square. So, but you see my point here, right? It's sort of like I think the word double is overcompensating for people not liking the sound of the word half. But I think for a start, and the idea that the half can in certain circumstances have negative connotations. Well, I mean, in certain circumstances, Democrat can have negative connotations. It depends on who you're around, right? Republican can have negative connotations. Some people would say it always does. Some people say that it doesn't. Some people can go through their lives and be perfectly comfortable with these labels. In Japan, look, I've been here 20 years. I've got a kid here. I'm still waiting for the Rosa Parks moment, for the get to the back of the bus and drink from the different water fountain moment that I had in the back of my mind might happen when you have a kid. I recently turned 10 years old. Nothing yet. I mean, he's in a class where there are other kids from multiple nationalities, including Chinese, Korean background. One Scottish kid, one my kid's half Kiwi. He just learned the national anthem, which I thought was kind of cool. I don't see anything at all wrong with the label half. And at the end of the day, it's just a label. It's just a description. I mean, you call them tomatoes or whatever. In the end of the day, it's going to have the same positive and negative connotations in the same way. Overcompensating for it by calling them doubles, to make them feel better, it just makes them look like dicks. Serious. I wouldn't go around calling myself a double. Hey, you're just a regular person. I'm a double. I mean, you can say that, and I guess if you want to compensate for a loss of confidence that you might have from people giving you a hard time about being half, which is a thing that happened to many of my friends. La Migra, they're after me again. You can have that, but look, it's when I grew up, for example, my experience of the word half, I would call myself half in terms of half Australian. I didn't see that as being inferior. I had half Maori friends, often in New Zealand Army families. I mean, probably majority of the kids at my school were probably had some Maori ancestry. I was kind of the odd one out not having any, which actually kind of made me feel, they were cooler than me, right? But they would call themselves, I had friends call themselves half caste, which I didn't actually understand what caste meant, and the fact that they called themselves half caste, when you think about it, is a horrible term, but that's what they would call themselves. Hey there, J-Vlog, sorry you didn't get a notification. I did set this up way too late, so I apologize for that. So, I grew up with that being a normal term. In the end of the day, if you keep attacking the term rather than just, for me, what's important is normalization. I mean, it's good to have, I think, a positive self-image, and not to have a negative self-image, especially associated with a superficial, third party. In the end of the day, the people who are only going to focus on the aspect of you that are half really are maybe other half people who are just interested in sharing experiences, and people that don't know anything about you. And it takes until you get to be about 35 until you start to realize that doesn't matter. We go through a huge part of our lives, really half of our lives, trying to create an identity for ourselves, and I realize in that time what superficial people that don't matter think about us matters, but it really doesn't matter. I am curious to see what a half kid in Japan does nowadays. Japan, I think, is in spite of the stereotype and despite of the neighborhood, Japan, I still think, is actually become a lot less ethnic identity focused than I think it was when I was a kid. The people that I knew that grew up who are the same age as me, partly because we're in Tokyo, no question, and Tokyo is more cosmopolitan. People are generally not in each other's faces so much as in the rest of Japan, in good and bad ways. That's right, half caste, Odie Jr. That's what my friends used to call themselves. My multiracial friends when I was a kid were all Maori. You look at the All Blacks, you look at the New Zealand rugby team, they look like half of that rugby team. Like most people, they have a bit of something mixed in. For me, it was Australian. But it was. I don't think that coming up with a counterbalancing label for double. I mean, again, if I was half, I'm not sure that the best thing I could do for my kid as a parent would be to insist to everybody else that they call my kid a double. I don't think that's a good idea, and at the end of the day, it's a descriptive label. I think treating words as stigmatized, creates the stigma, and creates a stigma, the fact that you're being careful around it. And in the end of the day, I gotta say, 10 years old, and I've been waiting for it to come up as a conversation or something. It comes up occasionally, and when it comes up with my son, it doesn't come up that he's half. It just comes up that he's also a New Zealander, or that he's got a New Zealand passport, which he's got a passing interest in. He learned the national anthem, which I thought was pretty cool. But yeah, Quint Rankid. No, honestly, I hope that the word double doesn't survive. So anyway, Victor's question was, what do we think about the word double to describe half people? As a parent of a half, I'm not going to be using the word double. Maybe it's just the culture of New Zealand that we're not a braggy sort of a culture, and it sounds like bragging. It sounds like inviting, unwanted attention towards a kid. Say, hey, look at my kid, he's double what you are. I would be like, no, Dad, stop. Pretty much. My kid's gonna, he's gonna get to the age where he's gonna be like that soon. So that's my view on that. I don't know what people think in here. That's a lot of halves. Siko Simon says Sergeant Bilko. That is indeed true. But anyway, that's my first topic for the night. Let's get into the topics that we have. Now, this is interesting. There's actually, during this week, I was at a talk which is being hosted by a kind of a consultant guy who became the mayor of Yokosuka, which is where the big US naval base in Japan, near Tokyo, is. And he's talking about the sort of policy challenges affecting local governments and so on. And when asked the question, what's the biggest policy challenge for local governments in Japan, for the next 10-20 years, he said, well, everyone focuses about shoshika. Shoshika is declining birth rate, and they talk about koreika, the aging society everybody hears, but he used a word I never heard before, which is the tashi shakai. And I was like, Tashi Shakai? And then he showed the kanji, and that's the kanji, and it's kind of shocking. You lived in Japan too long when you feel uncomfortable looking at the kanji for death in the middle of a word. But he said Tashika, or like Shoshika, the opposite of Shoshika, low birth rate, is Tashika, high death rate. He said that local governments in Japan have this problem with a high death rate, that there are more and more elderly people dying. And not just that there are more and more people dying and the problem of having enough funeral homes and, all that sort of thing, but the whole framework around them, for example, it was until really our generation pretty much, it's pretty recent that, it was absolutely normal for grandparents to live with the family of the eldest son. So the eldest son gets the house, but they also have to take care of the grandparents, which is quite a burden, especially for the wife of the son-in-law in the traditional setup. So 3-generation homes are pretty typical in Japan, and particularly when the elderly parents became, the grandparents became bedridden or sick or whatever, it's actually a huge financial and life burden for the eldest son. But this is also why they get priority on inheritance in Japan. But this sort of structure, but the kind of upside of it for local governments and for society is that governments didn't have to look after the old people, because it was understood by society that it was always the eldest son or the eldest child that would have to look after the grandparents. So you'd have that, and if they died, well, generally speaking, Japan, like post-war, every family had like 6, 7, 8 kids. Everyone would chip in for the funeral, so that wasn't a thing. The idea that if they needed medical care, if they passed away, there'd always be someone around. They'd be living with other people, and so there was sort of a social network where, without the need for government intervention, the elderly were sort of taken care of and could be buried and have funerals and whatnot. Whereas what's happening now is, yes, I see the Soylent Green references, but it's the other way around right now, because the 1970s generation of parents, all stopped having kids pretty much, or most of them had only one kid in Japan. It means that now you've got a whole generation of elderly where there are not enough kids to look after. There are not enough kids to look after all the elderly, so the elderly are living on their own. There's not enough elderly care facilities. The waiting lists, months, and they're super expensive. So what you have is a generation of elderly people living by themselves in the same apartments that young people live in one-person apartments, which also became a thing after the 60s in Japan. That there's all of these, there's a huge number, there's an oversupply of apartments made for living by yourself in Japan. And I often talk about how Japan is a fantastic place to live on your own. And I think this is part of why the birth rate is so low. But it means that also there are people now. There was a few years ago, and there was a change to, in the event of divorce, the wife gets half of the divorced husband's pension. So there are a bunch of divorces that happened immediately upon retirement because they didn't want to spend retirement living together, and you've got a bunch of elderly people living alone with no family or social framework for looking after them or checking in with them or handling the funerals. And it's local governments that you have all these stories now in the news about these people who get found months after they died in their apartments, and no one to take care of them when they're sick, no one to take care of them with for funeral arrangements. And this is actually as much a burden. At the end of the day, there are hospitals for giving birth, there are daycare, there is daycare for kids and whatever. There's not enough, but it exists. But the idea of the society is completely unequipped for handling elderly people dying alone as increasingly. Sorry, this is quite depressing. I realize as a subject, but it's interesting as a policy thing that this is, from a local government perspective, actually more, because they're starting from zero infrastructure on this. This has always been taken care of by families. And, there's going to be like the entire baby boom generation, which is going to, the population of which is going to get up to being nearly like half the population of Japan. They're all going to be dying, and there's going to be like no one around to take care of it. It's going to be a big challenge for the society. It never occurred to me until this person started to describe it. And he was describing it from the perspective of the burden it puts on a local government. When you talk about the taxes and so on, that if you want government to step in and take over that, again, it's just going to add on to the tax burden of my kid, as well as myself. But yeah. Someone, by the way, I just see people talking about the label on my shirt. Yes, you never go back. No, this is a Samoan rugby jersey. Talofa Day. I have no connection to Samoa whatsoever. Some German people do. It used to be a German colony before New Zealand took it over. But I have Fijian connections, but not Samoan. But I went to a high school with lots of Samoan guys, and, good rugby team. So yes, quite enjoy wearing the jersey. But anyway, this was a problem I never really thought about. And when it was described, I was like, whoa, that is actually quite a big problem, and it's quite a difficult one to deal with. So, that is that. Once you go blue, you never go book. Indeed, Sergeant Bilko. So that was interesting. In terms of the World Rugby, the Rugby World Cup being the best of all time, check this out. This is an official press release, but I thought it put it out pretty well. So check this out. 1.84 million tickets sold for this Rugby World Cup. 99.3%. I mean, just incredible attendance, actually. You think about how many Soccer World Cup or Olympic or whatever, when you think about like not so popular teams playing each other basically in front of, really small or empty stadiums. The Japan Rugby World Cup, rugby isn't the top sport in Japan. It's a popular sport in Japan, but it's not by nowhere near the top sport in Japan. 99.3% attendance. 1.8 million tickets were sold, and these were expensive tickets. I mean, I had to pay for Namibia 3 seats, and they weren't the best seats. They were like okay seats, but they weren't the best seats. They were like off on the corner on a diagonal, and they were like $400 each. I spent like $1,200 to see New Zealand play Namibia in a stadium of 50,000 people, I think the attendance was for that game, and it was full, and there were people who were paying like $1,000 a ticket for the best view. So in the fan zones around the stadiums, I think they could have actually done better. They weren't open before the game. I wanted to go check out the Chofu fan zone before the Namibia game, but it wasn't starting until the game started, which was a bit disappointing actually. But 1.13 million people in the fan zones that were set up around the country just for watching games on big screens. Apparently one of the top 5 ever television audiences, like for anything ever on television in Japan, was Japan versus Scotland on TV. Nearly 54.8 million people watched that on TV out of a country of 120 million people, basically half of the country. And where television is dying, nobody watches TV anymore. 54.8 million people watched the Scotland game. 437 billion yen, that's US dollars, roughly $4 billion economic impact. So 1.7 billion digital video views. What else have we got? Record legacy program, I don't know what that means. But yes, in the final game, record attendance. Yokohama Stadium's never had 70,103 attendees for a game before, and they got a great game. So I thought it was pretty well done, Japan. I think they did a really awesome job with the World Cup. Which comes to this, I mean, of course they say this, but I think it's actually genuinely statistically provable, as I've just gone through, that this really was the greatest World Cup of all time. Apparently 2 million Heineken beers were sold at stadiums. They were worried, all this focus on there not being beer during the World Cup. Obviously that was well and truly addressed, and again, it was a bit like how I talk about how I was so surprised how when Japan had the said that they were going to increase tourism, foreign tourism in Japan, from like 200,000 tourists per year to like 10 million tourists per year. I thought they were smoking crack. They're already right now up to 30 million, and now they're going for 40 million. So, oops, sorry, I've opened that lid that triggered a notification. And they've done it. I mean, it is the thing about Japan. They can fluff around, as we're seeing with the Olympics and whatnot, and with the marathon getting moved to Sapporo, and all of the people who are saying that they don't want the Olympics in Tokyo. It's too much hassle. But when they commit to doing something and doing it, they do a really great job with it. So yeah, Mitch B. So Mitch B, a lot of comments there from Mitch B. If you @mark me Hiko Simon, I will pay attention. Otherwise, I'll assume it's just sort of chatter. But Mitch B, has a word called Sakura. Does our host know the meaning? Yes, I do know. People are paid to make it online so others will join it. Yes, I've heard of the concept of Sakura. It's a common concept. Are you implying that there were that all the attendees for Sakura at the World Cup games? Those are expensive tickets, and they were hard to get. Those lotteries were oversubscribed. But yes, I'm familiar with the term Sakura in terms of when you have unpopular events and you want to make them appear more popular than they are. People just stand there and pretend to be customers and in lines out front of a shop, and people will just join the lines. A bit like with the not the Temptations. There's the Irish soul movie. Well, anyway, there's a movie where there's a line outside for auditions for a band, and someone joined because he thought they were selling drugs, which would never happen in Japan, of course, but people do join lines all the time here. So yes, familiar with that concept. Sharing this is a promo from Arisha in Tokyo. She set up a new channel called Non-Native Creative. This is just going to a web link. I am subscribed to this. And I'm because I'm on it, right? So what she's done is this project, kind of the heads up of it is that she's gone around basically interviewing people, not just in Japan, I believe also in Hong Kong and other places, but basically foreign residents of countries where they live pursuing creative stuff. She interviews them basically kind of like a podcast format, although I believe there's also a video recorded for each one. She's got heaps and heaps of cool people, including of course myself, so you know it's going to be good. Honestly, I kind of wonder how this really qualifies as creativity. I'm very happy to join. Of course, I'll talk forever. It was great to see the setup of someone who does these kind of interviews, like I've done before as well, but in an extremely organized and professional manner, which I found very difficult to relate to. But look, the series looks like it's going to be really good. A lot of preparation's gone into it. I was lucky enough to be in one of them. I think my one's going to be in December, but it starts November 15, which is like 2 weeks from now. And go subscribe, go check it out. Non-Native Creative, there's the channel, and it's going to be a good series. The commitments, I was going to say the temptations, and I dropped it, and then I realized I'd just be stuck thinking of it. Thank you, Tokyo 503. The commitments. I love it's a good movie for a start, but I do like the audition part of it where they find people. I like that particular part of you here for the audition. Anyway, that was go subscribe to that. That's starting soon. I'll probably feature that again next week. It'll be pretty good. Indeed, just with the Rugby World Cup, a quick comment on the final game. I won't linger on it. I know that you're not all rugby people, but look, it was for people who say that the Rugby World Cup is predictable. No one could have predicted those final few games. England, really clean wiped the floor with New Zealand, who beat South Africa, but then South Africa wiped the floor with England. They just rose up to the occasion on the final game. They played great rugby. The defence was amazing in the first half, and then they scored some beautiful tries when they basically closed it out in the second half. And Japanese people probably would have supported Eddie Jones because he was double. No, he was half. His mum is Japanese, right? And he's married to a Japanese wife. He used to coach Suntory. He used to coach the Japan team. So Eddie's a well-liked person in Japan. He's known as a bit of as an oni, as a devil, which is probably how he's known in Australia as well. He likes to poke the bear a little bit. I think he was a halfback when he was a player. You can kind of tell he makes deliberately mischievous comments to the press and so on. But he handled the situation relatively gracefully. It'll be interesting to see what job he goes to next. He's proven that he's the best Australian rugby coach, I think, and international coach in the world. Anyway, the Sergeant Bilko, you're a 15th, 16th. Hey, I'm curious. So when you say that, of course, what makes it? Knowing that you're from Sweden, it always makes it interesting. So what's the 1/16th? I mean, I know that there are people in America who get mocked about this sort of thing for indigenous ancestry and so on. Well, I mean, if there's something which raises your awareness or your feeling of being able to relate to other people, I mean, it's a tribal thing. It's a pretty base thing to focus on, but that's it. It is interesting. Believe in yourself. I don't know what you are. I'm not going to follow that one up. So yes, anyway, that was a good thing. Tokyo, the Ministry of Science has outlined a timetable for quantum computing, which they say by 2035. I think you're going to see quantum computers a lot before that. They talk about regular trips to Mars and Mars bases by 2040, flying cars in the next few years. In fact, they've already made the approvals for this. So, actually, I like that the Japanese government is focusing on these things. And hell, if they execute these goals like they execute the tourism and the Rugby World Cup, and as I guess they're going to do the Olympics, it's a good thing. I mean, I am hoping that, I can retire and go on a trip into space at least. Mars might be a little bit too much, but, the moon might be possible if the age, health, space race thing comes into balance, but at least a suborbital, ideally orbital, like tourism, go up to the space station, be weightless for a day or something like that. I want to do that, so and we're going to have flying cars and everything else. It's good to see that the government's focusing on that stuff. Warm Biz started on Friday, as everyone knows, because of course it's such a popular campaign and everybody gets into it. not. Of course, cool biz is very popular in Japan. Everyone likes to wear Hawaiian shirts into work and make a big deal about, hey, it's summer, but we're going to turn up the air conditioning to be like 28 degrees Celsius, which I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. It's like 75 or something Fahrenheit. It's high. I don't know. Someone in the comments drop in how much 28 degrees Celsius is. It's too hot to work anyway. You sweat. But people wear Hawaiian shirts and they like to make up, hey, we're working in the tropics and aren't we cool? Sergeant Booker, yes, they've been saying it's been 5 years away ever since the 1960s, but it's getting more real now. I mean, it's getting closer. I feel it. But yeah, but coming back, warm biz. So warm biz is the opposite of cool biz, where people 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I said 70, right? So that's. Did I say 75? Well, it's 70 anyway. Oh, wait a minute. 20 degrees Celsius is 68 Fahrenheit. So what is 28 degrees Celsius? That must be about 75, right? I think I must be close. But in any case, that's what they do in summer. The idea that the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry had was in winter, 80. Okay, so set the thermostat for 80, which is horrible. It's horrible to work in. In winter, they recommend the opposite. They recommend keeping the office temperature low, again, to save energy, the climate change and all of that. They basically promote everybody wear warm jerseys in the office and rug up at work. And of course, nobody wants to do that. Nobody does that, ever. Japanese offices are overheated. There's basically 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius all year round. See from Berkeley, 9 divided by 5 plus 32. Yeah, I remember something vaguely around. It had something to do with 32. I know it's, yeah. But, no, 32 is how you convert 82.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you. That's a good conversion there. So anyway, it's not going to happen. Shuri Castle. I've been to Shuri Castle. So what is Shuri Castle? Quick history of Okinawa from someone who doesn't really know a lot about it. It's kind of funny, actually. My wife claims when I met her, she thought she was half Okinawan, and then she discovered a few years later, her mum never got around to telling her that although her grandmother is indeed Okinawan, so not half, but I guess quarter by that measure, she discovered that the grandmother wasn't the sort of blood birth mother of her mother. But nonetheless, her family's all very into Okinawa culture, and we've been down there. The food is great, the weather is great, the lifestyle is great. So quick history of Okinawa, and what's the story of Shuri Castle, and why this UNESCO World Heritage. I mean, everything in Japan is UNESCO World Heritage. But this is a particularly significant sort of a thing. So quick history of Okinawa from an amateur, Japan resident. Okinawa existed as a sort of an independent kingdom pretty much like forever, like from when there were people. There have been people in Okinawa for thousands of years, it seems, archaeologically, but there's been a coherent kingdom there for as long as there's been Japan, like since about 600, 500 AD or whatever. And through the Middle Ages and through the Edo period, it was it existed as a kingdom called the Ryukyu Kingdom, or in Chinese called it Liu Qiu, and Japanese would call it Ryukyu, probably because they couldn't pronounce the Chinese L's and Y's and stuff like that. And it was an independent tribute-paying kingdom that, like Korea, that paid tribute to China. They don't consider themselves to be under the control of China, but Chinese nationalists claim that anybody who paid them protection money was part of the Chinese sphere of influence and is historically part of China. The extended maps of China that claim like everything, including like Korea and Okinawa, claim it on the basis that they pay tribute, that basically China would send ambassadors every year and they'd have to collect a whole bunch of taxes, and they called it tribute, but essentially they're paying taxes to the Chinese king. However, during the shogunate, and during the Edo period, they did maintain sort of connections with Japan as well, although they had to sort of keep them kind of on the quiet side. Japan didn't want to piss off China either. But it existed as this independent kingdom. So of course, roll up to the 19th century, two things happened. Japan suddenly, opened up to the West and went on this huge, basically, if you were invaded by aliens and you had to catch up their technology, where would you start? Would you start with physics? Would you start with literature? Would you start with culture? Japan did all of these things, but they did what probably people would do in the movies. They said, "Show us your guns." Japanese studied when they were catching up on technology in the West, they caught up militarily really, really fast. The whole Meiji period was basically, militarizing the country as a modern sort of military, preparing for, what became beating the Russians, a bit like this is the World Cup Rugby win, I suppose, at the 1904. But before that, they started having a series. They started kind of testing out their new modern army, and one of them was a war with China. China, which at that time was, of course, at the bottom of Chinese civilization, and its powers had been destroyed in the Opium Wars by the British. They just lost Hong Kong. China was being carved up by the Western powers that were carving up protectorates, and Japan was like, hey, well, we're learning how to become a powerful, normal country in the world, so let's just do what they do. So they picked a war with China. It was pretty much in the build-up to that where they saw China's influence gone. They sort of came out of the closet and said, hey, Okinawa, let's be friends. And Okinawa was like, maybe. It sounds like it was a bit of an Anschluss situation. It was a bit like they sent people down there to go and say, hey, we're going to join countries together and be best friends, but it wasn't entirely a consensual situation. But in any case, during the late 19th century, just around the same time that Japan was picking some wars with China and taking out parts of Dalian, for example, and Taiwan, it also asserted it annexed Okinawa as part of Japan, and it started integrating Okinawa on a separate basis, where Dalian was an overseas country and Manchuria that was adjacent to. In fact, no, that's not true. Dalian was part of Japan, but Manchuria was, of course, an independent, separate country. Taiwan was integrated as part of Japan. A little bit after Okinawa was, and Korea after that. So it was basically integrated as a separate kingdom that was integrated into Japan. It had its own distinct language, although it had similarities to Japanese. If you go down there and you hear proper Okinawan dialect, it's totally different. They have a totally different sort of culture. That is, indeed, it's kind of it's a little island, halfway between Japan and China, and it's got elements of both. But at the same time, its own distinct culture as well, and its own history of kings, its own history of sort of military, its own history of diplomacy and trade between all the countries around it, including Philippines and Korea and China and Japan, and it was basically being integrated into and being part of Japan right up until through World War II. Where it was considered more part of Japan, I believe, than other parts. This is why it was essentially remained part of Japan. Well, it was considered part of Japan after World War II. However, the fact that it was not fully Japan kind of reflects the way that the Japanese kind of used a scorched earth policy in a way, like the fact that they picked that as the place for the battlefield rather than the main islands, which were given a sort of different treatment. And when the Americans took over Okinawa during World War II, they basically, the Americans immediately became entangled both in stuff happening on the mainland and possible war with China, as well as, of course, very quickly with the war in Korea. So what became until 1953 an occupation of Japan, in 1953 is when the Korean Civil War kicked off, and it turned into using Japan as kind of like a base, an offshore base for Korea, and in the end for all of Asia. It became the same purpose for Philippines and same purpose for adding implied protection for Taiwan as well, and they were having their civil war with China as well, with the communists. So basically, Okinawa got turned into a massive sort of military base, and when Japan reverted to its self-control in 1953, the Americans sort of basically said, we're going to keep Okinawa as a base. And they did. Okinawa remained under US control, so when Japan went through the economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s in particular, 60s, 70s and 80s, Okinawa remained basically in the same sort of, destroyed state that it was after World War II, covered in US bases pretty much until it reverted. Now, was it 1972 or 1975? It was I think 1972 was China relations. I think it was 1975 that Okinawa was returned to Japan. And at that time there was debate whether Okinawa wanted to go back to being independent, whether it wanted to remain a part of America, whether it wanted to go back to Japan. But it missed the entire economic development of Japan, and it really kind of was separate through all of this sort of period. So you had this problem where when it came back into Japan, it was essentially, it had missed out on 30 years of economic development and post-war recovery, and it was still, the main island of Okinawa was 1/3 occupied by America. So, in terms of being covered with US military bases, to this day, it's still the case. Okinawa sort of got a bit of a bad rap, got a bit of the bad end of all the deals, basically. And through all of this, Okinawa's there are, for example, a lot of economic breaks. If you want to start an IT business or a call center or whatever in Japan, there's all sorts of incentives to go and set them up out of Okinawa. People in Okinawa, there's a higher rate of speaking English, mainly because there's so many Americans down there. And the history associated with that. There's also incredible hostility towards Americans, and not a small amount of hostility towards the central government, which they feel like treats them like second-class citizens, which in many ways they do. I mean, they're basically, Okinawa is Japan's sacrificial lamb to America. In terms of America wants to keep the islands for security for the bases, and it's basically like a huge land-based aircraft carrier in Asia for it to project its power from. And Japan recognizes letting the Americans have their way with Okinawa is pretty much the price of keeping good relations with America, as Hatoyama, Prime Minister, found out when he tried challenging, suggesting they might renegotiate the deal over that, and Hillary Clinton wasn't having it. She destroyed him over it. So basically you've got Okinawa's got this long and difficult history of integration with Japan, right up until this day. It wasn't until the 1990s, in World War II, there was the castle which preceded the period where the original Okinawan Kingdom Castle, Shuri Castle, a symbol of Okinawan sort of independence, kind of this monument to Okinawan sort of being having an independent identity for many centuries, or having its own culture, something which is being suppressed both under Japanese occupation and Japanese colonialization and under the Americans. This castle was burned down in World War II, obviously, like everything else on Okinawa. The island was destroyed. However, after it took a long time. It took 40, 50 years after the war, but in the 1990s, the Okinawan government, with the support of the national government, rebuilt Shuri Castle, which is the traditional castle, basically, for the Kingdom of Okinawa, and it's a spectacular castle. I went there like 20 years ago. It's red and white. It doesn't look Chinese. It doesn't look Japanese. It's its own. It's got elements of both, but it's spectacular. And inside, they sort of use it as a museum for all of basically the sort of greatest sort of treasures of the Ryukyu Kingdom, which existed for hundreds of years, and as a place for Okinawan people to go get a sense of their identity, separate to and individually from Japanese and Chinese and whatever. So it was a huge, hugely significant place that they rebuilt this castle, and they did so, and they did it as a kind of a cultural point for Okinawan cultural identity. I say all of this, you can see what happened the other day. They were preparing for a festival that was going to be held in the castle. It looks like a circuit breaker board. As unfortunately happens, if they plug in too many lights, it can overload the power board, and it looks like it was an electrical fire. Apparently, there were fire, sprinklers and so on in the castle that were for some reason removed a few years ago. So it was pretty much, as you can see, it was just a bonfire. The whole thing was leveled. It will probably be rebuilt. They're investigating the cause of it right now. Of course, it's pretty devastating for the people of Okinawa, which is sort of, getting the bum end of the stick on everything. And now they've had this happen. The national government has said that they will, they're sort of got to figure out what happened and whatnot and sort out, but it will be rebuilt. If you get the chance when it is rebuilt, go have a look. It's actually not so much the castle itself. I mean, every castle in Japan, even the one where the emperor lives, has all been burned down and rebuilt multiple times. But it is the fact that it's what was inside the castle. The museum itself had a lot of, priceless sort of cultural artifacts from Okinawan civilization, which are gone, and that's what kind of bums people out a little bit. So there we go. 1972, so not 1975, 72. Thank you, Tokyo 503. You're pretty good. But anyway, it's a tough thing, of course, for the people of Okinawa to have this happen. And I suppose there's a good lesson in there to try to make sure that they appropriately fireproof buildings like this in future, and that they take those sort of precautions, which it looks like they didn't do. But yes. Anyway, it's a terrible accident. It was an accident, but there you go. Quick thing, some people are complaining about this during the week. Just to be clear as well, during the All Blacks haka, during the war dance that New Zealand always does before the rugby game, over the years there have been many different sort of reactions. In New Zealand, there's actually a problem where often high schools, including my own, have their own school haka that they'll do before rugby games, and it's kind of cool. Well, they'll do a haka, they'll take turns doing haka to each other, like doing a kind of greeting, a war dance greeting. Of course, sometimes they get a little bit hot-headed, and when people start doing the haka at the same time and marching towards each other, they in brawls sometimes, actually. People get a little bit too worked up. The New Zealand haka has a history going back to 1905. And it wasn't always done before every game, but it was sort of done with special games when they were touring, and it was a bit of demonstration of the New Zealand culture, which was associated with the fact that the New Zealand rugby team was so strong as well, even though we were a little colonial island. And it became kind of a feature that was allowed, that the All Blacks would always do this before a game. The purpose is not intimidation. It was intended as a sharing of culture. And it's a cool thing, and through the years there have been different reactions and so on. And this was actually the English. Normally you'd line up and face it in a line. The English decided to do a V formation, which is totally okay. I haven't read anything saying that there was anything wrong with what England did. Actually, they did this sort of formation, they faced it, and they actually did catch the New Zealanders a bit like, oh, what are they doing? People over-focus on the haka in terms of the game and whether that played a role in England beating New Zealand. I hope it didn't. I mean, seriously, it shouldn't matter that much, but certainly it showed a bit of ready to go from the English, and I thought everybody thought it was great. There was only one problem, which was that they had their V extended into the opposite team's half, and the referees came on and said to the 2 people or 3 people that were crossing the halfway line, hey, this is okay, but you got to stand in your own half. You can't move forward into the half of the other opposition team. They ignored them. The result of that was there was a fine of £2,000, which is $4,000 for the 2 players that stood on the wrong side of the halfway line. And everyone started wailing that, oh, look at this. Everyone in New Zealand says this was fine, but now they're being fined for their response. They're not being fined for the response. I thought it was cool. And the English played a great game. Nobody's got to complain about what they did. It's just they ignored the referees and they stood on the wrong side of the halfway line. It was silly. But in the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm sure that probably any British rugby fan, given that most of them are rich, sorry, making fun of you, would quite happily pay the fine given the result. But just to be clear, there was no problem with the idea of that. I don't think it was actually a challenge. I thought it was an appropriate response. Actually, no, it was good. It was cool. If you like, I can't find. Hey, White or something. Good to see you. If you like convenience stores, and let's face it, it's one of the reasons that we all live in Japan, one bit of good news, one bit of bad news. One bit of bad news first, that 7-Eleven stores are partly just from the fact that they can't find enough staff to keep them staffed all night, and the pressure of, the economic pressure that the franchise was putting on owners to, it would actually fine and penalize owners financially if they didn't keep them open all night, and some just can't do it. So they're reconsidering that whole thing after there was particularly public. It became quite a bad image for the 7-Eleven chain when it came out that they were really pressuring a franchise owner who was sort of being forced out of business by the fines that the company was going to impose on him for not being able to open all night. That's a sad thing, however, that they're in that situation. It's always great that they are open 24 hours, but if they can't, they can't. I don't think you should, abuse them over it if they can't do it. I mean, you should, why not just reward people that stay open 24 hours instead of penalising people who don't, who knows. But some good news. It turns out, I saw another article which I'm trying to find, which I didn't find for this, but 7-Eleven is apparently not going to sell the oden in those convenience stores anymore. For those of you who, I assume most of you know what oden is, but for those of you who don't, I'll tell you. Oden is basically, it's a dashi. It's warm, it's hot water and dashi, and it's basically all sorts of hot boiled food. It's great winter food, and the sort of typical one is radish with mustard and sort of dashi and hot water, and it's good winter food, and it's not bad food, by the way. You can have sausages, you can have harusame, you can have daikon, you can have all sorts of cool stuff. Oden is good. But konbini oden, the problem with having oden in convenience stores is that, first of all, it stinks. I mean, basically, you've got like boiling turnips, and seaweed, stinking up these convenience stores, all winter, and just it's a horrible, and it's uncovered, and it's there all day. I mean, so I worry about, I wouldn't want to eat oden from a convenience store. I'd be worried about what gets into it through the course of the day, let alone the fact that it makes the convenience stores themselves horrible. So love oden, do not love oden in convenience stores, and love that convenience stores are reconsidering selling oden in them. That's a good thing. This story is particularly interesting when you think about the 2 paternity harassment cases that are happening at the moment in the court system involving foreigners, I believe, both of them, but both of them where people who took paternity leave were retaliated against, or claimed that they were retaliated against by their companies. everyone, male and female, it's not gender specific, are entitled to up to 12 months childcare leave when they have kids in Japan. This is obviously 99% taken by the mothers, but men can take it. It's just that most companies don't recognize it. And before we go bashing on Japan about this, again, in America, of course, you do get like 1 week's maternity leave. It's ridiculous, actually, how little time they get off. I mean, Americans are used to not getting this at all. In Japan, you get 12 months, so it is pretty good. But the problem is that there isn't really a cultural or a business practice recognition of this for dads. And it's partly, I think it's partly to do with Koizumi making a big deal about this. I think is he the minister for the low population problem minister or something like that, but he kind of made the point that he's going to take paternity leave, and the government's going to lead the way on this, which is a good thing. And if this is actually going to happen, if they're actually going to make dads take a month off to help with their wives or partners or whatever, because it's modern and all of that's cool, but if they're going to make dads, they're going to push them to take at least a month off when kids are born, I think it's a good thing. Baby steps, of course. Most countries, remember, don't have any form of paternity leave. There's only maternity leave in many countries. In many countries, you don't get a month. So Japan is doing okay, but of course the biggest problem isn't the legal. The problem here is that the legal infrastructure for recognizing paternity leave is way, way, way ahead of and beyond what the society recognizes and what companies recognize as being normal. And so it's good that the government's going to take a lead, which is kind of the way that Japan works to push, at least, for people for both sides to take this. I mean, we can't all be Norway, but we can get there eventually. It is a positive thing. I was in a US company, and in Japan, where my son was born, I asked for paternity leave and I was turned down, which pissed me off quite a lot. But this isn't just a Japan company problem, and I think it's probably worse, actually. When I came to realize later what it's like in America, you're better off in Japan, no question, when you're having kids. But yes, for dads, there still is obviously a clear assumption that child stuff is for women folk, and men folk are supposed to be working at the coal mines. And times are changing, even if they are changing slowly. Hey, Nippon Culture Quest, good to see you. So that is that. That's all the topics that I have for tonight. We're finished. That's 3 minutes early. I don't know. Maybe I could do a tune. What do you reckon? I could do something. Of course, as with last week, I'm happy to take your questions and comments. What do you want me to talk about? I'm all yours. 3 minutes. Anybody at Mark Kiko Simon, and it will flash out at me, and I will take rapid fire, or I will play tunes, whichever one. So you could either at Mark me and say play a tune, or at Mark rapid fire. Who knows? It could be I'll play a tune and need to rapid fire answer questions at the same time. If there's nothing, of course, if it's crickets, which it appears to be, I'll allow for the 30-second stream lag. Then I will just wrap it up, because there are about 90 seconds left. But hey, you know me, I can kick out a tune anytime if that's what people want. I can also kick out answers to questions anytime. Chiptune jazz, I like that. Okay, be true to you, says Believe in Yourself. I'm easy. That's me. Okay. Chiptuning, I like chiptunes. So let's have a go at that. Let's get the plugs. While I'm plugging in, feel free to. Scariest place I've ever been. Late Halloween question. Scariest place I've ever been. Good question. Scariest place I've ever been. I don't know. I've been in places that were physically not safe, but they were really fun. Like, I suppose I had an episode in the subway in Madrid where we ran into some muggers. Where I was going to have a crack at one of them when I caught them trying to rob one of the Aussie girls, and someone yanked me back, and I realized after that happened that they had a knife, and the guy's friends had knives and were looking at me. So I nearly got stabbed to death once, I suppose, on the Madrid subway. That was kind of scary. Well, it was scary after the fact, not at the time. I don't know. I used to be convinced that my house in Waihuru had ghosts in it. We used to hear. Truth is, I can never quite figure that out either. It was just a wooden house, and it was really cold, and it wasn't very well insulated. So at night, it would just make lots of noises, like with the cold and everything changing. And yeah, seriously, I was sure sometimes I'd come out. Even my grandma came up, and she was sure that there was like a burglar walking around in the house. I'd get up and check and there was no one walking around, but you could hear the floors moving enough that you'd be convinced that there were people walking around, which made me convinced while I was living there that they were ghosts. Looking back at it, it was probably just the climate and just the house, but yeah. Waito. Travis Moore, South Africa. I've heard stories about South Africa. I would still love to go to South Africa, but yes. But yeah, I guess I just haven't been to that many scary places. Well, let me, I believe that current one is saved, so let's do a new one. It's not picking up the screen. Yes, let's do a new loop. Let me just try this one more time. See if we can get it to detect. Okay, you share ghost stories while I set this up. It looks like we're not going to get the screen capture, but no matter, I will kick into it just with the music. So chiptune should really be about 110 BPM. So let's do that. I don't know, that's just arbitrary. Chad Jackson, Hear the Drummer Get Wicked, is 110 BPM. I always use that as my reference track for checking BPM on tracks like that. I guess it means we should also have a maybe low speed techno. Okay, let's actually. Okay, kind of Daft Punk. Daft Punk uses 110 as well. Okay, let's pick chord of F. Let's make it Ryukyu since we talked Okinawan today. Let's pick a bass line. That was actually kind of cool there for a moment. Okay. There. It's not really chip tunes, but it's kind of cool. That's kind of cool. Ah, that wasn't recording. Okay, that's kind of cool. It's not bad, but I want to save that. It's not really chiptunes, but you know, it is what it is. Hey Tech2, glad you like it. That's the show. Hope you liked it. Remember, every week, same time, 10:40 p.m. Japan Standard Time, you can join me here. We'll go through the events of the week. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter, follow me on Facebook. Of course, remember to subscribe, like the video if you liked it. Always encourages me. There's some booms in there. It's kind of Sergeant Bilko, what happened to Tokyo Digital Crew? Thought you guys had something cooking. We did, and I just got totally overwhelmed. I'm getting some of my breathing space back now, so I would like to kick that off again. We should totally do that. Hey Waito-san, always a pleasure to talk to you guys. Thanks for joining me. Remember, come back next week. Let's put those, we'll put those chords in there. That's kind of, it's kind of gamey. I like those chords. Anyway, see you guys later. Have a good evening and peace. See you later. Peace.